Welcome back to the Yamakaigan Railway. It's a long time since I've done a video on the layout, and that's really because it's a long time since I've done anything out here. It's been out in the dark gathering dust, but hopefully when summer comes I'll spend a bit more time here. So today I thought I'd just discuss what I wanted to achieve with this layout and whether in fact I have actually done so. Now, I didn't want any duck unders, so I couldn't run the layout all the way around the room because I'd need space for a door. So the best compromise was to have one side as a terminus station, and from there it would then run around effectively the three sides of the room, and on the final side it would come out into the centre of the room, essentially a peninsula. And rather than having a divider along the middle, I decided to try to make that 3D by incorporating hills, and that would give the feeling that you're actually more walking through the environment, through the scenery, rather than looking down on it. So I was able to fit in hills that do extend above my head height, and of course that has the advantage of being able to have your railway on different levels. Now along this side the hills opened out to provide the more traditional two decks. Over here the Great Divide resulted in some fairly steep hills, but even with minimal scenery on them, they still look much better than having an upright divider. I think most people designing a layout of this type would probably put this first leg of it parallel with the wall, given that it's going to be largely a terminus station. But what I've done is I've kicked it out so it comes out at an angle, giving a wider end to it, and it means that I've put the door further to the right than would normally be the case. Extended width at this end has enabled me to incorporate a return loop, and I didn't want it obvious because it would look basically out of scale, so I've incorporated it as a hidden return loop, and basically the trains would go in through the shed down here, and on the inside of this hill would reverse around and come out on the same track. With hindsight, I probably should have had it coming out on the second track. It just would mean I could turn around trains one after the other, rather than waiting for that first one to then vacate the track which has the reverse loop. This layout plan was drawn up sometime after I'd actually completed the main build. At the time of construction I really just worked off concept plans and the rest was in my head. The advantage being was that I could modify things as I went along and fit in new ideas as I came across them. The disadvantage I suppose would have been that if I'd worked off a standardised plan, then I could have made some economies on the construction of the baseboards. As mentioned earlier, I didn't follow convention and have these sides parallel to the wall. Instead I put in this dog leg. There was a good advantage being able to utilise the extra space here for that return loop, which I've used quite often. The hidden storage area, that was basically an extra add-on which was outside of the main train room and the garage proper. and this little module here was just a recent addition. So the main layout room itself had the advantage of this kick out at the top, where I put in a spiral and an Olex which ran around here. But basically it's a rectangle in shape. This area here was the lowest part of the track work. It was the port area, so basically sea level, and the coastal train climbed up around the outer reaches of the layout till it reached the main station. Now I tried to incorporate a 2 and 2.5% grade, and largely I was able to keep to that. The one complication was that the floor was sloped to allow rainwater to drain out in the event that it ever got into the building, and I was trying to work off measurements from a data point that I'd set up on this wall here to mark sea level. So as I plotted out the heights around the layout, I had to just really guess what the effect of the change in the garage floor would have on the tracks. It worked out pretty close, so no major problems there. But it would have been great if I had tools like this, which actually purchased after all the track work was done. One being a digital level and the other a laser level. They would have made life a lot easier if I had them right at the beginning. One thing that I was not keen on is having track running parallel to the sides of the layout. I think it adds more interest if you can have your trains running at an angle. I think it just adds to the dimension of there being more distance involved. So even a little head shunt track such as this one here is not parallel. Then the arrival and departure lines to the main yard, they run off at an angle to the side, and even the main yard itself, they are angled, but of course this little section here is parallel. In some cases you just can't avoid it. The track around the outside is largely curved, and at this point here it's still on an angle as it approaches the hills. And even where it's running along the other side, there's a slight curve to it, and I put in a small hill to give a reason for that curve to be there. Tracks for the main station itself, they also run at an angle to the layout, and at this end I've got a small yard. The main station diorama was intended to provide enough interest so that people might remain in this area for a little while with various trains arriving and departing. To this end it had hills surrounding it and tunnels at both ends, which sort of really discouraged you from following the first train which might depart from this area. Closest to the aisle was the coastal line with platforms 1 and 2. Platforms 3, 4, 5 and 6 were the Tokaido line, and up in the raised area was the suburban line with another 4 platforms. Ideally you'd view a layout from the side at head height, but of course that's not always possible. But what I have done here is I've set the station back, placed buildings in front, and then I've incorporated gaps between the buildings from which you can view the trains arriving and departing. Having the raised suburban line at the back meant that you could see more trains at the same time, and of course raised platforms are quite common in Japan. On these curves I introduced some super elevation or camber, and this was easy to achieve as the set track is held to the girder base by a couple of screws. So I removed those screws, removed the track, and to raise the actual track on the outside I inserted some matchsticks around the position where the track went. I did of course remove the phosphorus head. The track was then reinserted and provided a reasonable slope to the rails. What I tried to do is introduce different track levels within the main yard. The first 5 tracks are at the lowest setting, and then the next group of 3 tracks is slightly raised. Then we move further across and we have the main engine depot, and that is also higher up, and as you go further across I've got 2 storage tracks which again are higher, and then the main lines behind them just slightly raised as well. So even though these tracks are close together, it becomes slightly easier to actually see the detail of the trains and rolling stock. The advantage of this technique is better demonstrated as we move closer to eye level, as it becomes much easier to see the trains in the distance. And even from here you get a good view of the buildings in the background. On the upper deck I was able to do something similar. But in the area of the main platform, this was not possible. Here I had 2 tracks each side of the platform, so I had to keep their height consistent with the doors on the trains. But what I did do was I tilted this whole section so the back of it was slightly higher than the front, and that achieved the result that I was after. It's perhaps not an obvious change. It wouldn't work if you could see the trains from each end, because you'd see that they're actually tilted. But having the train on a slight lean doesn't affect their running performance, and for me it was an okay solution. The layout essentially had 3 main lines running through it. The first was the coastal line, which was intended to be run by an operator either manually or with the aid of automated schedules. This line also connected to the upper deck via the mounted line. The second was the Tokaido double track, and from here trains would be brought out from the hidden storage to run a loop of the layout, possibly stopping at the main station depending on what the automated schedule involved. And the third was the suburban line, which started at the main station terminus and ran through to another terminus station, which was actually hidden at the far end of the layout. Initially I was not going to have any freight services running on the line, as it would just be purely commuter traffic. And these schedules would be relatively automatic. Once the trains went into this hidden area at the end, they would be programmed to stop and then reappear out through the tunnel on the other side after a few minutes. This was my attempt to make the train journey longer than what it really was. So if you were standing in this area, you would still see trains arriving and departing from these two stations, but you'd not necessarily think that they are directly connected. This worked quite well. At this area I intended to have a bottleneck situation where the main lines would diverge into a single track which will go through the Scourge area and then proceed to the next town, which was stored behind this hill. Somewhere in there. I also tried this with the coastal line, which ran from this terminus station through the whole layout and then arriving at the main station here before disappearing into the hidden storage. The track ran around the edge of the layout, and what I wanted to do was introduce a time delay to make the journey longer than what it really was, similar to what I'd done with the suburban line. After negotiating this curve, the track went into a tunnel and would then be hidden from sight. It was positioned underneath the suburban line station, and the track actually diverged into 3 lines which could hold trains and allow others to pass. Locals and freight trains would stop over for the longest period of time, and expresses would proceed with only a minimal delay, and eventually the train would come out at the tunnel at the other end of the section. This did work well, but sometimes it's just really good to be able to walk around the layout and follow a train that you're controlling. So in more recent times I daylighted the storage area. I inserted these 2 windows, put in a bit of acrylic to keep the dust out, and I can now follow the trains through their journey. Now, I have mentioned a couple of times about the hidden storage, and you may have seen from earlier videos that it's not located in the train room itself, but outside in the main garage. Now, I do have a camera set up, and I can just check it out to see what is actually happening out there. But if I've got a problem with a turnout or a train that won't start, then of course I've got to go out there and fix it. Now, it's not far to go, but if you have to go out there 2 or 3 times in a row, it seems like a very long distance. I think it's a psychological thing of having to actually leave the room and go out into the cold of the main garage. The alternative would have been to have a spiral in the main layout room which would drop down to a lower deck and have that as hidden storage. That would certainly be a lot more convenient to get to. I think that over a period of time you'll get sick of having to crouch down to attend to your trains. So overall, I think the decision not to have it as part of the train room was the right one. I'd also wanted the power to the layout room all controlled by one switch, so when I left the room I could flick the switch and everything would go dead. Unfortunately, that didn't quite work out as I hoped, as when I entered the room I'd flick that switch and the power board would trip out. It was mainly due to the fact that a lot of electronic and electrical gear will draw extra current as it starts up when you first turn them on. So to overcome that, I used some remote power switches, and I can just now turn them on one area at a time. And that avoids the sudden surge, and that stops things from tripping out. As far as lighting of the room goes, I started off with the normal incandescent bulbs, and then when the opportunity arose I moved to the fluoro type with the promise of cheaper running costs and long life. Well, they certainly didn't have a very long life. I found they kept blowing after a short period of time. So I welcomed the opportunity to move to LEDs. In fact, I also put LEDs throughout the main house, and I've really noticed the difference or the saving in the power bill. So I'd thoroughly recommend that you make the change to LEDs in your house if you haven't already done so. And the initial bunch I had didn't really have a long life. They were cheap ones, but they didn't seem to last. As better brands became more affordable, I've made the change, and now I'm quite happy with them. So I've used a valance to hide the lighting, and this works quite well for the sides, but for the main area over the peninsula, it's not really worthwhile putting a valance up because you're going to see the lights anyway because that area is so wide. I suppose in time I could make the move to having Wi-Fi LEDs so that I could change the colour and brightness and stimulate such things as sunrise, sunset, electrical storms and the like. Unfortunately, my layout is not set up for night running, as I've made too much reliance on optical sensors which require a shadow to activate, and these I've tended to use at the slow down and braking positions at most station stops. I should have used infrared sensors, and I actually have used infrared in quite a number of places throughout the layout, but they're mainly in tunnels and in the hidden storage areas. I've also used reed switches within the construction of this turntable so that the bridge position can be correctly aligned. One example being the shunter, which moves the tank wagons past the filling station and stops each one for a set period of time. At the end of the track, a reed switch and a magnet on the train stops it and starts the process all over again. If I'd used infrared sensors throughout the layout, then I wouldn't have had to worry so much about trying to angle spotlights to throw light into areas which would otherwise be too dark to illuminate the optical sensors. If I was rebuilding this, I would have a lighting plan to throw light in a more even fashion throughout the whole layout. On my main tracks, I have also used track occupancy detection. These detectors monitor the power feeds going to the particular track, and if a train or lighted car should bridge the two rails, then the detector would activate. The software would therefore know that a train had entered the block or subsequently departed. There were a few sections of the layout where problems were encountered using this. These were where I had signals. These signals hooked into the actual rails and monitored the current direction to determine if a train was travelling in one direction or the other, so that the appropriate aspect would be displayed on the signal. The actual occupancy detector would give a false reading where the signals were, because it would think that there was a train on that particular block. The simple solution, of course, was to isolate the sections of track that had the signals attached. But this created its own problem. The isolated sections were now receiving slightly more power. Then as a train travelled into that isolated section, there would be a sudden surge in its speed. So as a solution, I inserted diodes into the power feeds to the isolated section, so hopefully it would balance out with the other parts of the track. On the whole it did, but there are a couple of places where there's still a slight change in speed of the trains. That's because recently manufactured trains typically use a very low voltage, and any variation to the track voltage affects its speed. Detectors used to activate road crossings also created similar problems and required a similar solution. Well, what's coming up? I've decided that I'll make a start on getting the area behind the station completed. It's been sitting like this for a very long time. Originally it was going to have high-rise buildings here, but they would need to be removable so that I could access hillside at the back, which has removable sections, because behind there is the storage yard for the high-speed Shinkansen, which I might need to access from time to time. So what I think I'll do is instead of having buildings along here, I'll put a retaining wall and build a somewhat steep hillside in front of the removable hills, and I probably need to construct them from plaster cloth, as they'll need to be fairly rigid and be able to stand independent of the hills at the back. So they'll probably require a couple of vertical supports. Maybe I'll do a video on that. The buildings that I was going to use in that area can go behind the station here as a low relief backdrop. I think that it's also worthwhile if I put together a video on the various methods that I use to bring sound to the layout. Well, I've been talking for long enough. Thank you for taking the time to watch. Bye.